Hey, everybody. Welcome today to the Disciple Standard Podcast. We're glad you're joining us. We've got a great show for you today. So we're going to do something unusual. We're going to start by talking about our new thumbnails that we're putting on every show. If you're following us on social media, watching our videos, you're going to start to see these. We're going to have a moment where we welcome new people into the life of our movement and celebrate what God's doing. And then we've got a great interview with Dave Bosscher. He's a pastor in Michigan who has really caught on fire with this movement and disciple making, and it's just made a big impact. We're looking forward to hearing from Dave. At any rate, thank you for joining us, and let's get started. All right, now for the topic today, Jake, I want to do something a little unusual, which is I want to spend some time talking about the thumbnails that we're now making for each of the videos for our podcast. And because you're the principal graphic designer, it's meant to be more like a conversation. So are you ready?
Oh, yeah.
All right, so let's just, maybe I'll start this way. I want to start kind of with the theological, just musing. And I want to start by talking about the burning bush. So in Exodus chapter 3, you'll have this story, and I think most of us are familiar with this. Moses was out tending his flocks when all of a sudden he sees this strange sight. He sees this burning bush. And what's peculiar about it, if you read Exodus chapter 3, what catches Moses' attention is that this bush is on fire, but it's not being consumed. It's not being burnt up. And of course, there's something about God that's being revealed, and it's a wonderful image and metaphor. And there's so many things that we could explore. Why did God reveal himself as in a burning bush? First of all, the fact that there's this bush on fire but doesn't burn up. Most fires depend upon fuel. But here's a fire which is independent of fuel. It doesn't need fuel at all. And finally, as this chapter goes on, and God reveals himself to Moses, and finally tells Moses his name is I am who I am, which means that he's existence himself. He is the one necessary being that doesn't depend on anything else for his existence. He just is. He just exists. Anyway, we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but the thing about fire that I think is so interesting is here you have, not a tree on fire, not a mountain on fire. In fact, later, God does throughout the Bible reveal himself in all kinds of fire. You just think about Mount Sinai blazing in fire, or when they were traveling through the wilderness, there was the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke. Fire is it's a very standard way that God reveals himself, but he first comes as a bush. And then he says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which, boy, there's a lot we could talk about. But one of the things that becomes very clear in the Bible is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's not like they're superstar people. In fact, they are the most ordinary, even dysfunctional people that you could imagine as you get to know their character. Abraham's a coward. If you want to think about a dysfunctional family and a dysfunctional father, how about Isaac? Jacob, the one thing he's known most for, especially even in his name, is being a swindler and a cheat. And yet, here, God can use these kinds of ordinary people, broken people. Well, anyway, here's what I want to get at. If you follow the theme of fire through the Bible and God revealing himself in fire, maybe, the long arc of it takes us to the day of Pentecost. And what ends up happening is that on the day of Pentecost, now that Jesus, and this is at the heart of the gospel, has made it so that we can come right into the presence of God. When Moses walked up to the burning bush, he had to take off his sandals, and the Bible says he had to look away because he was afraid. And all throughout the Bible, when people encounter God, they're deathly afraid. They have to die. We as sinners can't come into his presence. But once Jesus is consumed by the wrath of God and takes the punishment in our place, now we can be brought right into the presence of God. And what's interesting is, on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit comes into each believer. And how does the Spirit come? It descends on believers as tongues of fire. And this, I think, is the idea that every Christian now has become like a burning bush. The fire of God is now within us, but is not consuming us. And it's as though wherever we go, when people encounter us, God's flames, God's fire is in us. We're not being consumed. We're like our own burning bush, as ordinary and unusual as we are. God uses each one. And I think this is remarkable. The idea at Pentecost is that the Holy Spirit now has become, it's like the fire of God has become distributed and decentralized so that every believer becomes like the signpost for God. And I think that's what our movement is about. There are a lot of Christian movements today that depend upon just one extraordinary person, and everyone's got to go there. But the idea in the Bible is that it's become distributed, and you don't have to go there. God's got his people coming to you, and that's why he says, go make disciples. These, individual people like us are like the burning bush, and God's sending us out. Each of us has the fire of God in us, but we're not being consumed because we've been made whole through Jesus. Anyway, that's the theological idea. Now, let's talk about our thumbnails. When we first started the show, our thumbnail looked like this. The Disciple Standard Podcast, episode 1, kind of pastel colors. And we thought, well, people are going to want to see the title or the name of the podcast, which was fine, right? I think we developed this, and in one way it looked fine. But, talk a little bit. I mean, here we were just beginning. I don't know if we really had an idea of what we were doing yet, but this is where we started. So let's start there. What do you think?
Yeah, it was the first. I found this nice poppy color. I love that pastel look. Template, and I kind of took what I liked from that, and I just, like you said, we want to see what the show is. We didn't have an end goal yet.
We didn't have an end goal in mind yet. We actually probably made this before we ever filmed the first bit of filming, and this was our first thumbnail, and we were going to pop these on every show, and we did. But then we moved on. I'll call this our 2.0 version. We said to ourselves, okay, look. It's not really the title of the show. We've got to realize that we're talking about people, and more than anything else, this show is about a people movement, a multiplying people movement. And so we want to do that, and we thought also to ourselves that maybe we can upgrade the graphics just a little bit. And so this is an example of our next thumbnail. I'm sure you put it up on the screen for everybody. What were we thinking as we made this one?
So for that one, we talked, like you said, more about people, and we want to see who we're interviewing. Who are these ordinary people? That next step of getting that personal connection, because we thought that people are who people want to listen to. They don't want to, like you said, don't want to come for one person. They want for everyone, for God's people.
Right. And so this was our next iteration. I think this was an improvement because, hey, this isn't just a show that's about some technical thing. It's about people. Mm-hmm. But then I think, and this now just really had to do with paying attention to what you find on YouTube or what's the modern standard for today. What we realized is that, let's get away from all this graphic stuff. Really, what we need to focus on is people's faces. It's the expressions, it's the story, it's who they are. And so here's the next iteration. You see now it's Adam and I, and we went through and we changed out all our thumbnails and we made them like this. And you can see in the background, we had this network idea. We were trying to think about, well, okay, how do we talk about our network? How do we talk about multiplication? And now almost a zoom in on our faces so that there's a real connection with people. Yeah. So, tell me your thoughts here.
Yeah. So for this one, we all kind of collaborated between the media people and you and everyone, and we came up with that network idea. We're we want to convey the idea of that we're all kind of connected. We're all part of this program, and we want to keep growing it. Right. We don't want to be the last link. And the reactions that people in the clip or in the thumbnails there, have that emotion behind it that's captivating you. You want to catch it.
That's right. And we do notice that if you look at videos on YouTube or social media today, this is a very common format to be more zoomed in on faces, to catch emotion. And we're hoping that people will be more drawn in to watch these episodes. But now, here's kind of the story of what happened. We have one of our pastors here and a good friend, part of our discipleship movement. He's a great disciple maker himself, Aaron Mamuriak. I'm sure at some point we'll have him on the show. He actually walked in, and his background is in marketing and in business. And he actually runs a YouTube show himself. And he looked at the thumbnail. He says, I like it, but here's what I do. I just make like fire and a big explosion in the background. And I think he was sort of joking around to a certain extent, but he's like, no, people are drawn in to fire. And so we now went to the next step. And now you can say we've got all the best. We're moved away from just the title to now we include people, to now we have the close in on our faces and expressions. But now in the background, there's fire. And talk a little bit about this one, because I love how we've gone with this.
Yeah, it actually, when I sent it to you the other day, I immediately loved it way more. And one of the things that I noticed now, and I mean, this has been the last week we've been talking about it, was that the title has gotten smaller and smaller in each of the clips.
Okay, interesting.
So that first one was big, right in your face. The second one was, half the screen off to the side. And the new iterations now, especially with the fire, like your eyes are drawn more towards not what the actual name is, right? Like Disciple Standard is written in this thin font. All it says is episode 5 if you glance at it. So you don't know what it is. And I think it's so much more appealing and it draws you in more. So like, I want to know what that is. I want to know more about it.
Yeah, and now when Aaron first mentioned this, I think what he was saying is like, look, there's an energy, there's something appealing and something attractive and fire, maybe even something dangerous, something explosive.
Yeah.
I mean, you name it. And I think his idea is that, look, just if you're scrolling through and you see fire, you're going to maybe be attracted to that. And at first, that seems a little gimmicky to me. Maybe if you're listening in, you're going to say, wow, what are these guys doing? It's just a big gimmick. But, finally, what sold me on this is what I reflected on in the beginning, is this whole idea of each one of us being our own burning bush. When I was in college, I had a pastor at the time who he encouraged people to tell their testimony. And what he'd say after he listened to people give their testimonies is, wow, I always get this feeling like when I hear someone's testimony, I'm standing on holy ground. And I think actually it was after we created this graphic that I really thought about what he said and began to appreciate it. All of us carry the fire of God in us who are Christians, who are believers. And there is something very holy, something very explosive, something very powerful. And I think that's at the heart of what our disciple movement is trying to capture. We're trying to convey this, that instead of you having to go somewhere or to someone, we want to upgrade the operating system of the church such that every believer is got this incredible spirit and power of God at work in their individual ministries. So what's happened is, it's become distributed. It's become decentralized. And I think that's at the heart of what our movement's all about.
Yeah, I agree. I think like we talked about, like the capturing the people, these ordinary people that we've been interviewing the last 6 or 7 episodes now. Just seeing how great their network has even grown and how it continues to grow, not just from them, but from me and you and from everyone else here. Like it's not about us. And that's the best part.
That's it. So, okay, Jake, I hope this works out all right, but I want to invite audience feedback. What do you think? Do you like these new graphics? Do you think this is a good thumbnail? Do you want to flame Jake?
We had a lot of that this
Look
past
out,
week.
Jake. You could get flamed by a lot of people who say, I hate this. But now you know what's behind our idea, that we really believe there's a Holy Spirit-fueled movement and that the fire of God resides in every ordinary person. And there's some explosive multiplying thing that is happening, not just in one place or through one person, but is being distributed out. We're about to move to the tipping point. As we do, you're going to see, we have 615 people that are each their own, source and locus of God's power. And I think that's very powerful because each one of them becomes a hub for multiplication. And it's just about an explosive power. Anyway, Jake, thanks for all your good work on it. You're amazing. Appreciate your work on the show every single week as you put it together. If you have a thought, an idea, a comment, what do you think? Is this kind of thing that's going to, just, cause people to stop, to listen, to tune in? Is this going to turn people off? Are they going to wonder what's going on? What's your feedback? We'd love to hear from you. At any rate, we're now going to move to the second part of our show called The Tipping Point. Here we go. Okay, for the tipping point this week, we want to take some time and welcome people who have just joined our network. Again, you'll see that this is a network that's constantly growing. It's multiplying. This week, we're welcoming 3 new disciples. So welcome to Jeremy Pafer, who is a disciple of Jeff Otto, to Ariana Rojas, who is a disciple of Kelsey Mamuyak, and Tamaya Klinger, who's a disciple of Rachel Pickart. We want to welcome you. We're so glad that you have decided to join our disciple-making system. And as you learn to become a disciple-maker yourself, we're just excited about what God's going to do in your life. Now, I do want to just acknowledge Jeff Otto, who is a first-time disciple-maker. And there's a great story here. I've never met Jeff. I don't know Jeff, but I do know this, that he's from Tomahawk, Wisconsin. Now, we're located in South Florida. And so Jeff, Tomahawk is quite a ways from here. And here's what I understand. Jeff heard about this disciple-making method and process and multiplication and thought to himself, wow, this is something I want to get connected to. And he simply contacted us. We connected him with a disciple maker, Chad Skur, and Chad's been discipling him. And now that was just maybe 2 months ago, toward the end of November, when he got connected with Chad. And Jeff now is making his first disciple, and we're glad for it. It's always a big moment when you move from being a receiver, and Jeff has been receiving, to being a giver, which I'm sure just hearing about your story is what you set out to do. I'm excited about what God is going to do through Jeff, and so great job. The total number of disciples now in our system is 615 and growing all the time. Welcome, everybody, and keep up the good work. And now we're going to move on to the next segment as I interview Dave Bosscher. All right, everybody, we're joined today by Dave Bosscher. He's a good friend of mine and pastor in Michigan. He's been a part of our 222 disciple process now for a number of years. He has become a really wonderful disciple maker. He has a network that I think now is about 34, 35 people deep, disciples and descendants, which I think is tremendous. God has multiplied his ministry, and it's had a tremendous impact in his church. And so, Dave, I'd like to just welcome you, and maybe we can get started this way. Just talk a little bit about what disciple-making ministry has meant for you personally.
Oh, man, I could go on about that forever, but I'll try to give you the short version. Thank you for the kind introduction. Scott got me into this, what has it been, 4 or 5 years ago now, give or take. And I've had the privilege I actually counted them up recently, and it turns out I've actually discipled 43 people myself, and that's not even counting the ones. And so it's amazing. It doesn't feel like it's absorbing my life, but the number of people that I've actually gotten to have a close-up view of their life while Jesus is doing really cool stuff it's probably been one of my favorite parts about being a pastor for the last 5 years, if I'm being honest. So what difference has it made for me, though? I would say my first experience was when I started picking up a couple of young men. Young men are my kind of bread and butter. I love guys in their 20s. They're my favorite. So I picked up a couple of young guys and started discipling them. And the feeling I actually had was being totally deflated, and not about discipleship, but about everything else that I do. Because the level of influence and impact and growth that I was getting to watch, it almost made me feel like preaching was superfluous, because I was overcome with a sense of, this is a big tool that is missing from the arsenal of my church and the American church more broadly. And so it was incredibly cool to see that progress, but it made me want to rethink just about everything else. I would also say that for me personally as a pastor, it very much has impacted my leadership and my preaching. There's another coach that I had a few years back. His name is Phil Struckmeyer. He planted a church called Impact Church, and at the time that church had planted 14 others or something like that. So really successful and huge on discipleship. And I was asking him questions about how do you bake discipleship into the system of a church? And he just asked me, well, how would you disciple one person beginning to end? I said, well, I have a few starting tools. I'm still working on this and this. And his answer back to me is like, well, how do you expect to disciple 200 people when you don't have a plan to disciple one?
Right.
The fact of the matter is, discipleship is just helping people find their next steps with Jesus, right? And it's silly to say, but the fact that is so challenging for me when I was first starting, or the fact that was new to me, tells you something about how competent I probably really was as a church leader. And I don't mean that as an insult to everybody, it's just something we're missing. And so it's made me think really differently about the way that I preach and the way that I lead as well. Just everything winds up looking different when you're looking at it through the lens of how do you help individuals make next steps.
I love that. And I think that's really key, especially the first thing that you talked about. Listen, pastors, listen in on this. You know that there's any number of things that we get involved in or engaged in, big ministries, small ministries, groups, meetings, all kinds of things. I think you've articulated very well, probably the most important thing we do, and probably has the biggest impact, is one-on-one relationships. And anyway, I'm glad you found that as well. Talk a little bit about what you think bringing this ministry into the life of your church has meant for your church, because I know it's really begun to permeate the life of your church. So what's it meant more broadly?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So I think where we're at right now, if I could describe where we are in the process, I wouldn't say yet that it has totally permeated the life of a church, but we're kind of at that tipping point where you're starting to not so much see it as feel it. So I remember it was Scott. It was an acquaintance of yours I heard say this once, that making a discipling church is kind of like playing in an above ground pool. You know, if you've ever been in an above ground pool before, there's only so many things you can do. You run out of stuff pretty quick because you can't dive in. There's no diving board. It's just, you know, if you just run around in it. So inevitably, what people do is they start. You maybe have a whole group of people in a pool, but one or two of them will start running in a circle. And it makes a bit of a whirlpool. And you don't even need everybody to do it. It's just that as the currents start to pick up and it starts to swirl, whether people want to or not, it just sort of starts to pick up and people get pulled along. Well, the same is true about impacting the culture of a church with discipleship. I think it was maybe Peter Drucker, I recently heard the quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that's true. And when you're impacting at the level of culture, that's really what happens when you're kind of starting a network of disciple makers. It not only shifted my priorities, it shifts the priorities of other people and the way that they see church and the way that they see ministry and their rhythm and their walk with Jesus. And so I would say what's happened in my church is that there's enough people going that the current is kind of starting to pick up, and certain little habits and perspectives are kind of starting to pull others along. And they don't all see it all the time, but it's fun. In my church, the way that we have kind of baked it in is, first of all, I made it a goal a few years back that I wanted, 10% of my church, in other words, like one person in each row. Like, what would change if one person in each row knew how to talk to somebody about Jesus until that person either loved Jesus or knew why they didn't? If they knew how to do it 1 hour once a week in a way that didn't put their blood pressure over the top, what would change? And I wanted to know the answer to that. Once I kind of had that small army of people, the way that they're deployed is that every single one of our teenagers at some point in high school will be approached by an adult who has chosen them and asked, hey, will you do this with me? And I've picked you because you weren't assigned to me. I want to meet with you. And the other way that it works is that when we have Discover Lakeside, which is our kind of new member / inquirers kind of a class, anybody who's not sure of the gospel or who is confused on one point or another, we'll hook them up with somebody else, and they'll either go through all or part of the 222 materials. And so that's how we're doing it. It's kind of fun to watch because it's not as though like everybody could point to it and say that's the thing. But if you're kind of part of it and if you're doing it, you can notice. It's kind of like the currents are picking up in that above ground pool. So it's really fun. I'm really eager to see where it leads.
Okay, that's amazing. And I think that's so true. I have a little slogan that I like to say: you go slow to go fast, you go deep to go wide. And a lot of that has to just do with culture. You say to yourself, well, if I just start discipling one or two people, is that really the best use of my time? But over the course of time, as you begin to do this, you see that those currents start picking up and something amazing starts to happen. So I love that. I'd like to just, in particular, ask you a question. Even hearing now, you've personally discipled 43 people, and you've got this network of descendants as well. For someone that's maybe just getting started, they've maybe taking on one or two people, is there any advice that you'd give? How do you over time grow that network? What does that look like? What would be your best advice?
Well, one piece of advice. It would be two different pieces of advice for two different groups of people. And I need to rag on my own profession just a touch right here. Because the advice I would give to a typical layperson is not what I would say to a pastor. And it's not because the pastor is at an advantage and the layperson's at a disadvantage. It's because of the other way around. To pastors, I would just say, be patient, go deep with one person, get good at this, then take on two, then take on three. But take it slow and understand you don't always know what you're doing when you get started.
Okay,
very good. Therefore, if you try to multiply, you will pick you will choose a lot of people for the wrong reasons, and you'll try to fast forward it, and it just won't go anywhere. Pastors are just the worst when it comes to this. I've trained several, and I'm always fighting this, and I know you were fighting it with me for sure. So pastors need to hear that over and over. People that aren't pastors, you're not at that disadvantage where you're worried about trying to work it into a church and you don't overestimate your own competency in the way that we do. So you probably have an advantage. You come in a bit more teachable. If you're new to this, here's what I would say. The scariest part of all of this is going to be that first time that you try to figure out who you want to disciple and then go making that ask. And it is all at once the hardest thing and also the most empowering thing once you've done it. Because as soon as you know how to have that conversation right, and they either say yes or no, and then the whole relationship hasn't burned down and you're still okay, the level at which that opens your horizons to other things that you might do in relationship that you never would have thought of is pretty astounding. Because all of a sudden, if one thing kind of didn't kill you, because it's the scariest thing to do. It's an awkward conversation. How do you? I have to point by point walk people through it just because they're like, how do I say it and how do I not make it weird and how do I not pretend that I'm better than you because I'm trying to decide, am I saying that like I'm way up here and you're way down there? And I would say if you can just make it through that ask, if you can just do that and do that early, like if you are very clear in the gospel yourself, even if you're only 6 or 7 weeks into getting discipled, the earlier you start, the better. As a matter of fact, with certain people, there are some people that I will just disciple as receivers. So one guy that literally just left my office, his name is Adam. He wasn't a Christian 2 years ago. Now he is. And it's really, 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 really fun. And we are both having a blast. For him, I'm not forcing him to pick up anybody right away, although I'm probably going to make him start discipling his wife sometime soon. And if he's watching this, he's terrified to hear that. But it'll go fine. But if you're a person that you really start out getting the gospel, or you grew up with the Bible, I would encourage you to try to make that first ask sooner rather than later. Because then at the same time that you're enjoying the rhythm of receiving from somebody else, you're also enjoying the rhythm and the challenge of pouring into somebody else. And if you're intimidated or you get tripped up or, something terrifying happens. Like, for example, they ask you a question. Your first time you go, am I supposed to have all the answers? It's so much easier when you have that person who's walking with you to turn to the following week and go, okay, this weird thing happened. What do I do with it? So I would, just get started, get through the ask, and then I guess the last thing would be those first few weeks, make your meetups as regular as possible. Don't do a lot of rescheduling. Let it become a normal part of the weekly rhythm that people can look forward to, hunger for, and just kind of fall into. But those would be the first few things I would say.
That's great. It's great advice. Listen, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your insights, and really pleased with what God's doing in your life and in your ministry as you become a very able disciple maker. So, Dave, thanks a lot. It's good to connect. And for everyone, thanks so much for joining our show today. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to the Disciple Standard Podcast. We're so glad you joined us. We encourage you to continue the conversation by joining us on social media. Also, if you want to learn more about the Multiply method or learn about how to take the Multiply pledge, we encourage you to join us on our website at multiply222.com. Have a great day.